Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside the Beltway, joined by United States Senator Tom Cotton. Good morning, Senator. We are extremely grateful on this week of Thanksgiving for your regular appearances. I hope you are gathered with family and friends this Thanksgiving.
Yeah, Hugh, thank you very much, and happy Thanksgiving to you and all of your listeners. We do have a lot to be thankful for in this country. Even in tough times and in a dangerous world, we're still deeply blessed.
I agree with that. Let me begin by asking, because I haven't talked to you since the conclusion of the APEC, quote, summit. We got some pandas out of the deal. What do you think?
Well, Hugh, color me skeptical about the value of having a few pandas in our zoos if Joe Biden is going to continue to conciliate Xi Jinping and grant one-sided concessions. So I don't think we need to have our China policy set by a bunch of panda huggers.
What do you think of the so-called opioid deal? Because I don't believe a word of it.
No, I don't either, Hugh. I mean, it's another example of granting concrete concessions for ephemeral promises. President Biden agreed to take remove some sanctions, and Xi Jinping simply promised to stop shipping fentanyl precursor chemicals to Mexico. Xi Jinping also, for instance, promised back in the Obama era to stop cyber attacks against America's companies and our government, as well as not to militarize the artificial islands China built in South China Sea. Yet here we are 8 years later, and those islands are heavily armed to the teeth, extending the reach of the People's Liberation Army, and cyber attacks continue against our country. So we should not be taking the word of Xi Jinping and the communists who run China, especially not in return for concrete, material, immediate concessions by the United States.
Now, Senator, you are on Intel, and you're also on Armed Services, so the next two may cross over, and I know you never, ever divulge classified information. But I listened to a podcast today, Dan Senor talking to Haviv Rettig-Gur, who's going to be on tomorrow, Times of Israel correspondent, about the propaganda war being waged by Hamas and by the IDF against each other, and Haviv's worry that actually Hamas, assisted by useful idiots in the United States, is winning that. What do you think?
Well, I worry very much, in particular, about TikTok in America. If you look at public opinion polls, you see that sympathy and even support for Hamas and their cause is higher among young people, especially the youngest Americans. I think that's in no small part because TikTok is increasingly a cheap source of information for young Americans. That's why I've been calling to ban TikTok in America for a few years now, and why I think if we're going to pass a supplemental aid bill next month to support Israel and Taiwan and Ukraine and to secure our border, we need to include a ban of TikTok. A good rule of thumb, Hugh, when thinking about communist China is what we did with communist Russia. And if we treated communist Russia in a certain way, that's the way we should treat China today. And we would have never, ever allowed communist Russia to own a major media platform in America that disseminated propaganda to tens of millions, maybe more than 100 million Americans. We shouldn't allow it to happen with China today. We need to ban TikTok.
Your friend, Secretary Pompeo, tried in the Trump administration, as did the former president, to get TikTok banned, and the court struck it down. Do you think there's a constitutional way to force the sale of it? I don't want to shut it down if it's run by Americans, but I don't want the algorithm feeding Americans poison.
I think there is zero constitutional problem with the United States saying that we're not going to allow a foreign adversary to control the dissemination of news in our country. TikTok, its owners, its managers are not American citizens, by and large. It's controlled by the communist government in China. Anyone who claims that there's a First Amendment problem or that it creates an unconstitutional bill of attainder is in all likelihood a shill who's on the payroll of TikTok and should be ashamed of himself.
Now, I want to ask...
I will say this, Hugh. One point you made about the sale of TikTok. I'm a little skeptical that you could genuinely sell TikTok in America to an American company and cut it off completely from the way the algorithms are maintained under the thumb of the Communist Party of mainland China. But if it's technically possible and that's necessary, for instance, to get some Democrats to vote for a ban on TikTok next month, that's something that I would entertain, but I would want to be certain that it completely severs a new American version of TikTok from the control of the Chinese communists.
Now, you're also on the Judiciary Committee, which means you have oversight of the Department of Justice. And we know that the Department of Justice is off the rails. Merrick Garland is not conducting himself as any prior Attorney General has. But I'm very concerned that the Department's Office of Civil Rights, its Division of Civil Rights, is nowhere to be found among all of the marches, including one that occurred in Manhattan on Saturday, where they were just chanting, kill some Jews, and many other things. Where is the Division of Civil Rights, Senator Cotton? Have they been, as the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, been in front of your committee?
Some time ago, remember, Kristen Clark, she was one of the most radical nominees of the Biden administration. She scraped by on the Senate floor by the skin of her teeth. She's overseen by another one of the radicals, Vanita Gupta, the Associate Attorney General. As long as those two women are in charge of these investigations, I think you can continue to see the Office of Civil Rights on the sidelines or developing some kind of false equivalence between the rampant outbreak of anti-Semitism on America's campuses and the streets of our big cities, all controlled by the Democratic left, and very rare isolated incidents of crimes against American Muslims. As was said after the BLM riots in 2020, that the demand for racism on the American left is much greater than the supply of it from the good and decent American people. You could say the same thing about Islamophobia today. Unfortunately, you can't say that about anti-Semitism, yet Joe Biden and the Department of Justice, for reasons of their own internal party politics, is drawing a false equivalence between the rate and the scale of these crimes.
Now, I also want to point out to people that the Department of Justice Office Civil Rights Division has always been quick to follow into any fact pattern where violence has been done to a minority in the United States. And I've been glad they've been willing to do that when local authorities are either inept or unwilling to bring criminal charges against an individual who's had their civil rights violated under the color of law. And that's a 14th Amendment derived statutory authority. I have not yet seen the announcement from the Civil Rights Division that they're going to open an investigation into the murder of the Jewish man in L.A. by a pro-Palestinian activist. The DA out there, not surprisingly, waved off murder charges. What do you think, Senator? Are we going to have the OCR in here?
Well, it's not just that murder in Los Angeles, Hugh. It's other acts of violence or intimidation across the country on America's college campuses, where, again, you have left-wing prosecutors, often prosecutors who have been elected in part by George Soros' money, who are not taking action, not taking firm action against the intimidation of, say, Jewish students on campus. And the Department of Justice seems perfectly content to sit idly by and not protect those Jewish students' civil rights. Imagine, Hugh, if this outbreak on anti-Semitism on America's campuses was rather directed against Black Americans. The Department of Justice would man the ramparts to confront that kind of race-based crime, as they should, yet they're doing almost nothing to stop this wave of anti-Semitism on America's campuses.
Now, yesterday we had an in-depth hearing at the D.C. Circuit, panel of 3 judges, into the gag order, which is, in my view, patently unconstitutional on President Trump, former President Trump. And I'm hoping the Supreme Court just reaches down and takes it like they did the Nixon tapes away from the D.C. Circuit in 1974. Do you expect that to happen, or are we going to have to wait for the Obama court to get it wrong, for the Supreme Court to get involved?
Well, I hope, Hugh, that the D.C. Circuit makes it a moot point by ruling promptly as well. As a litigator who's gone to courts of appeals, oftentimes these decisions can sit for some time. That's always a bit frustrating to the parties at issue. But, of course, there's a big difference in the public interest and the needs for the American people to have matters resolved when it comes to things like this unconstitutional gag order on the leading candidate of the opposition party or, say, election contest versus, say, a contract dispute between private parties. And I hope the judges who are hearing that case in the D.C. Circuit appreciate that fact and are working overtime, despite the holiday, to get this decision out as promptly as possible. In my opinion, like I think yours, it's a vast overreach by a liberal activist judge in President Trump's case to try to issue a gag order on a man who, again, is not just a former president. He is the leading candidate of the opposition party. So I hope the D.C. Circuit makes a very quick decision, and if necessary, it goes to the Supreme Court promptly as well.
All right, last question, Senator. You broke the New York Times a couple of years ago. I mean, you broke it. And today they've got a story by Michael Bender and Michael Gold, the headline of which is Trump's dire words raised new fears about his authoritarian bent. Does anybody believe that at all? New fears? I mean, I'm sure there's some nuts out there that think he's an authoritarian, but do you think his campaigning is raising any new fears?
Hugh, there is a word in Hollywood and book publishing for what you see in the New York Times these days. It's called fan service. It's when the screenwriters for a serial television or maybe a series of movies or a sequence of books gets overtaken or begins to focus more on what the fans are demanding as opposed to what the storyline and the plot development calls for, what they originally had in mind from an artistic standpoint. And the New York Times primarily, when it writes about Donald Trump these days, is engaged in fan service. It's like, what do the paying customers at the New York Times want to read? And they want to read things like that article that says that Donald Trump's rhetoric is raising new fears about authoritarianism, as opposed to, say, Joe Biden's Department of Justice sicking the feds on Joe Biden's opponents. Things like sending FBI agents to interrogate people who are singing hymns at pro-life clinics or parents who are complaining at school boards, or for that matter, I have to say, going after Democratic critics of Joe Biden, like Bob Menendez in New Jersey and Eric Adams in New York City. It's possible those men engaged in crimes, but it's pretty curious that it happens to someone who's the chief critic of Joe Biden's Iran policy and Joe Biden's immigration policy.
Fan service.
Go after
Hadn't thought of that.
Someone who's a great champion of Joe Biden.
That's the first time I've thought I framed the New York Times in terms of fan service, and you are absolutely spot on. Senator Cotton, have a great Thanksgiving. We'll talk to you on the other side of the turkey. Senator Tom Cotton, thank you.